Welcome back to the Parent Edit podcast. In this episode, I am talking to Emma Bradley, who is one half of the 360 Mama. The 360 Mama is a platform designed for mums who are thinking about having a C-section or have unexpectedly had a C-section. They have also just released an incredible book. Today, Emma and I are going to be discussing everything related to C-sections, planned and unplanned, and what you can do pre and post. Let's dive straight in with the big one. Why is there so little information and support for people who want to go through this electively or end up in this position anyway?
It's really frustrating, and for Hannah and I, who run the 360 Mama, the majority of the conversations that we have with our in-person clients is always about this. Whether it's, as you've said, that they've chosen an elective C-section or the other half where it's been an emergency, across the board everyone feels really unprepared for what happens in the surgery, what happens afterwards, and then actually kind of longer term beyond just the immediate recovery from surgery, the C-section scar and the recovery afterwards. It can affect you for years actually after birth. There's definitely a huge gap in the wealth of knowledge out there. It's what we're trying to fill at the 360 Mama. And the book that we wrote really was based around that exact question, and we tried to follow up with as many questions as we receive every day on our platforms and make sure that the answers to them were all in the book.
I think what is so astonishing is that there is such a huge C-section rate in the UK right now. That alone, the fact that it's not more talked about recovery and preparation equally is just incredible. There is this narrative among pregnant women still in society that discomfort is just part of the course, and that is pre and postpartum. What is your view about discomfort?
I think it's super important to just really share the message that pain is never normal. It can be that there are certain symptoms or signs that are quite common in pregnant and postpartum women, but they're not normal, and that's a really different sort of narrative that we need to share. As a postpartum professional, it really frustrates me that it's often almost like a joke now among mothers, isn't it? That, you know, we all leak, or we can't hold our bladders, or we can't do this anymore. And to some point that extends all the way into pain as well. And the other side of that is that potentially some topics still feel a little bit taboo and women aren't that comfortable to discuss them. So there's this, you know, whole group of people that are out there really experiencing symptoms that affect them day to day and not knowing where they can turn to, not knowing who they can ask for help, and therefore just living with them. And what we try to share on the 360 Mama is the concept that actually a huge amount of those problems have quite simple solutions if you're just finding the right person to support you.
How does unmanaged pelvic pressure or imbalance during pregnancy affect your core and your pelvic floor after a C-section?
It's really important to understand that whatever type of birth you've had, you will benefit from doing some pelvic floor rehab after birth. And I think that's a big misconception with C-sections, is that your pelvic floor is protected and that you don't need to do as much. The majority of the impact on the pelvic floor comes from pregnancy. We also want to recognise that for a lot of women, they have gone through a lot of kind of labouring before an emergency C-section happens. And so there's a lot of pressure and change that happens to the body throughout those, you know, potentially hours worth of labour. The way in which it affects the core and pelvic floor, honestly, can be different for everybody. And certainly for me in my job as a pelvic health physiotherapist, I really advocate that we do a full and proper assessment for everyone prior to making that decision about what is the right rehab for them. Because for some people, you need a lot of, let's say, sort of strengthening exercise in order to regain normal function. But for a lot of other people, we have to do a lot of undoing work where a lot of held tension, for example, which is even more common, I would say, in emergency C-section scenarios, can cause very similar problems like incontinence, leaking, pain. But we have to approach it in a very different way rather than just doing lots of squeezing exercises. So I suppose my message would be really encourage people to seek the assessment postpartum.
Let's go from the top with a C-section. So can you actually explain the process? Because the layers, is it 6 or 8 layers? It's batted around a lot.
I think what we're trying to explain, and I've seen similar videos as well, there are some really brilliant demonstrations online actually of the different layers that will label them all, which is probably helpful to maybe look at. But it's the understanding that your C-section scar that you see on that surface layer has a lot more to it than just treating the surface layer. So understanding that in the operation itself, they'll cut through the skin, which is that first layer, but we've also then got fat, muscle, fascia. You'll then have a second wound on your uterus where they'll cut through the uterus. Once your baby has been delivered, the uterus is generally stitched up with dissolvable stitches, and then on the surface, depending on your surgeon's choice, it might be stapled, stitched, etc. But when we then want to come to talking about your recovery, it's about recognizing that all of those layers that have been cut through in order to deliver your baby have to go through their own process of healing, knitting back together, some of which are left to do that of their own accord, and then 2 of them being like actively stitched up. But when you're treating your scar, or you're considering why you might have pain or dysfunction in this abdominal area, it's because this whole area has been affected by that surgery, rather than maybe just that line that you see along your pubic line.
A lot of women will hold back from investing in their comfort during pregnancy, sometimes believing that support garments or self-care are luxuries rather than essentials. And I think that applies to even like postpartum recovery treatments as well. Over your time of running this business, have you seen that mindset shift?
I think the shift is definitely happening, which is so positive. Even in sort of the past few years, I've really seen a real uptake in people, first of all, maybe visiting me while pregnant in order to get good advice about preparation, to understand about what comes next. They're booking their mummy MOT or their postpartum assessment, which is a service that I provide before they've had their baby, with the understanding that actually it's so much easier to prepare and do things while you're pregnant and to have them all set out, as opposed to, new motherhood can often be quite chaotic. You're exhausted. You don't necessarily then have the time to be organising appointments. That has shifted massively, and I do think it's because there's so much more conversation around it on social media, and as a result, people are much more willing to talk about, what's normal, what's not normal. But even so, it does appear that people will be very quick to spend money on something for the baby, for example. Brands do very well at marketing a product for the baby or a brand new buggy or all these kinds of things that are, actually really expensive. But it's much harder to get a woman to invest not only money, but time in themselves as well. And that's a barrier that I think we do try to keep overcoming with our content.
Prioritising yourself physically, especially if you're electing and you're going to go through that, you are categorically going to have all those layers of your stomach cut open. Don't underestimate that.
Yeah. Also, understanding you don't always have symptoms immediately either. And while, we hope very much for people to have a really positive birth experience and a really positive postpartum experience, it doesn't necessarily mean there's no work to do. So I honestly have never ever come across a client that hasn't benefited from some input. And it might not be because they've got really debilitating symptoms, but hopefully what we're doing is we're setting them up to, prepare really well for their later life. Quite often some of these problems come to light later on as that tiny baby gets heavier, becomes a toddler that's a lot more active, or even as a woman, like in our cycles, perimenopause and menopause is another time in which sometimes these symptoms become more apparent to us. And we could have got on top of things a lot earlier if we just assessed it at that postpartum period.
What is the difference in preparation and recovery between a planned and an emergency?
It is really important around emergency C-sections to discuss the impact of birth trauma. It's something that we see an awful lot of. It's definitely something that, if you look at comments on some of our posts, it's something that affects a lot of people. And in that emergency situation, it's because ultimately the control is taken away from you. It's a frightening situation, and there's lots of unknowns. With a planned C-section, generally you can be in control of a lot of those variables, so you can make sure that the environment feels safe to you, that you use music or lighting or something that your partner might be able to provide that helps you to sort of stay in a present moment, that makes you feel calmer and safer. And the impact of that is huge for women. But of course, the other benefit to a planned C-section is that you kind of know what's coming. And so you can put a lot of things in place at home so that when you do leave hospital and you are often sort of left to your own devices, that you've made your environment as comfortable as possible. It's set up so that you can proactively rest, so that you don't have to be running up and down the stairs. If you've got other children, hopefully you can kind of have organised some childcare to support you so you're not trying to do the school run on day 5 post C-section. You know, there are so many factors that I think make a real big difference to your recovery if you can just have thought of those things ahead of time.
Mentally, going into a C-section knowing that that's your choice.
Yeah.
I think it's very underestimated how the impact of it not being your choice when you end up with one. It can be, you know, harder to heal from all aspects when there's like emotional trauma. And I guess that leads us quite nicely onto the question about making friends with your scar, because I will hold my hands up and say I still am a bit like,
Sure.
Maybe it's just me. I feel like I've had other surgeries in the past where scars have made me don't want to touch them. But I think there's definitely emotional trauma with that. What's the science behind that? Why is that?
We've heard lots of phrases like the body keeps the score, and you know, we hold trauma in our body, and that is just generally true. We kind of really recognize that often when we're working with clients that are having real difficulty accepting their scar touching, quite often recommend some counselling, or we work with a couple of really fabulous birth trauma therapists. And in the book we've got a birth trauma therapist who's contributed a whole chapter because it's such a big factor in C-section births. It is very difficult, honestly, to overcome that emotional trauma. So usually those two things kind of need to cross over and be combined. We're very often talking to clients, teaching people, explaining it online, that there are so many techniques in which we can apply to gently encourage you to begin interacting with your scar. That might mean doing it over clothes at first, that might mean observing it in the mirror rather than sort of in real time. All of these therapeutic techniques generally mean that people can overcome that squeamishness and start to accept it. You know, for a lot of people, it's something that brings out a lot of emotion, and it can be a really emotional therapy session.
Is there any role that external supports such as pregnancy garments or abdominal supports can play in helping women more comfortably during their pregnancy or post C-section?
Certainly during pregnancy, if you're really struggling with discomfort, so if you struggle with pelvic girdle pain, for example, you've got really awful back pain and you're kind of just struggling to do day-to-day activities, although as a physio I'd be recommending that you do some exercise and you do some things to support yourself, sometimes those garments are just the added sort of level of support which can make a difference from a woman not being able to do her normal day-to-day activities and actually being able to keep going to the end of pregnancy. So in that sense, they definitely have a role to play. Postpartum garments are very specific to the individual. So for a C-section scar in particular, if you know that you've got a history of keloid scars, which are scars that kind of outgrow their border and particularly raised, often quite sore, can catch on your clothing, then we do know that through research and evidence that compression can make a really big difference to how that scar develops. It does require a long-term commitment, so people have to be recognising that we're not talking about wearing it for a short period. Typically we're talking about wearing compression over that scar for up to 6 months, so it's a real commitment, but it can make a really big difference to how your scar eventually develops. That's quite different to somebody that's just choosing maybe to wear a belt for support or to give them a bit of feeling around their core of support. And I think that's a more personal decision. It does generally need to be something that you get some guidance with. If you feel excess pressure around your midsection that actually leads you to feel a bit like heavier in your pelvic area, or makes you feel like maybe your bladder leaking could feel worse, then potentially it's not the best option for you. But again, there are other garments that provide like undercarriage support that might be more suitable. So I would say if you're thinking along those lines, potentially again, it might be worth getting some sort of expert intervention before you decide to invest.
That's why I was actually interested in Hugup, because it is about the support from underneath as opposed to like the kind of compression and pulling together, which I think if you talk to people about abdominal support, they just immediately think about kind of like the getting your waistline back. Hugup has been a game-changing addition to my 3rd trimester and allowed me to keep working, running around after a toddler and walking my 2 dogs. Hugup's medically designed support wear alleviates pressure on your back, pelvis and your abdomen, reducing pain and discomfort whilst increasing circulation and improving your posture. Developed with doctors and physiotherapists, Hugup offers clinically back relief when you need it most, because comfort and wellness belong together. How can we start to change the narrative from just getting through pregnancy and turning that into preparing? I'm definitely more conscious about recovery this time and have a completely different outlook to it. I just felt so much younger last time and really did think that I would just recover just like that.
One of the sort of phrases or messages that we do use quite a lot with the 360 Mama is the concept of like helping women to thrive in motherhood. So really trying to change the narrative from bounce back conversation, which is much more to do with maybe how your body looks rather than how it actually performs, and recognizing that, as you said, if it's your first pregnancy, you maybe don't have that experience of how much pregnancy and then your subsequent birth really impacts your body. But also, you know, everything that comes after it. So yes, there is likely to be sleep deprivation that impacts how your body performs, how you heal. If we can just put a few little cornerstones in prior to the birth, that means that we can prioritize things like sleep and rest where possible. It's not always going to be as simple as sleep when baby sleeps, because you might have other children at home. But if you have people that are offering support, people that are offering to help, it might be that they could provide you with some really wholesome meals. So what you're putting into your body makes a big difference to how your body can recover. You can make a real difference to how you feel in motherhood long term if you just prioritize the right things in those early days postpartum. And that's physical and, you know, emotional and mental health as well.
There is definitely nothing worse than having to look after someone else feeling awful.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there is parts of any kind of birth experience that are going to feel like that, whether you've had the best birth in the world or not. There are days that inevitably you're not going to feel great recovering. But if you kind of imagine that you might have to do that long term, like, no, let's not normalize feeling that awful, and let's normalize getting our strength back. Strength and fitness for me has become so polarized to just being physically able. 10 years ago, me would be like, what? You don't care about having a flat stomach? Could not care less. Really do care about my lower back pain when lifting a toddler up.
Absolutely, yeah. For me, like a huge passion of mine is that I love exercise because it makes me feel so much better. So I find, you know, sometimes the burden of motherhood and the mother load that they talk about can be so overwhelming. And just being able, for me, go out for a run, sometimes just for 20 minutes, it shifts my entire day. And I think if we can give people the opportunity to return to something like that eventually, we should be, you know, understanding that we can be giving them something so much more than it's just about sort of how their body looks.
That is so true. I think especially, for people who are either naturally very athletic or historically very active, getting back to that place, it is possible if you've had a less than preferential birth or if you've chosen to have an elective. Staying active during pregnancy, how does that influence the recovery from a C-section?
There's loads more evidence now. So they're actually finally investing some time and money into research around this, which is a huge positive step. But we do now know that there are huge benefits to baby and mum if they are able to keep active in pregnancy. And typically, you know, there's a reduced risk of postpartum depression and anxiety for women that have stayed active during pregnancy. So there's that factor as well. But generally, in terms of your recovery afterwards, if we're looking at how can we sort of regain your strength postpartum, if you've sustained a relatively good level in pregnancy, then there's less of that decline to then build back from. And that's, you know, really impactful because it means that we're starting at a better level, which means that, you know, it's easier for us to regain that strength afterwards. You know, muscle memory is a real thing. So if you've never exercised before and then you decide immediately postpartum that you're going to exercise because you want to look like you've bounced back or you've lost weight or etc., then it's really tough for the body to manage that because it's a complete shift from anything you've ever done before. But if you've gradually sort of maintained your exercise levels in pregnancy, then typically it copes better with returning to that afterwards.
How can we help pregnant women understand that the gentle exercise isn't just about fitness, it's about preparing them for like a smoother healing process?
We talk quite a lot in our content about the exercise actually including breath work, for example. Breath work is something that you can do and start again from day one postpartum. Benefits of breath work on your pelvic floor function and your core function is huge. So if that's something that you've familiarized yourself maybe with pregnancy exercise, pregnancy yoga, pregnancy Pilates that helps to teach you that concept, then it is so much easier for you to pick it up again, and you can pick it up again immediately. You're doing something really positive for for your body that will support its healing from day one. And we can reframe that, because that's genuinely exercise. It's very different maybe to what a lot of people will be considering as going out for a run at 6 weeks, for example, which again is misinformation, and it's not helpful.
It just blows my mind.
Yeah.
I feel like just everything would have fallen out of me at 6 weeks. Can we talk about overhang? I think a lot of women struggle with this.
Yeah, has the most impact on our page. And again, we want to be really clear about, we are not promoting that you should expect to change or alter your appearance in any way if that's not what is your priority. But we also want to understand that for a lot of people, that's something that they feel really vulnerable about. It really impacts their body confidence. It really impacts how they feel in clothes. And actually it can be the source of like pain and infection as well. And so for those reasons, there's physical reasons why somebody might really want to treat that goes a long way beyond just what it looks like. We try to explain that the overhang is very rarely related to weight, and that's a really important conversation. It's caused by almost like the pinning in of scar tissue. So as we discussed earlier, there are levels of scar tissue that are developing in lots of different layers internally beyond just what you see on the surface. So as they develop, if they cause sort of like a pulling in effect, they can either become stuck to each other or they can become stuck to the structures below them. And in some cases that goes as far as to stick into pelvic organs and to stick into the pubic bone itself. So the more that something is pulled inwards, it's going to create a shelf. And then no matter what else you do, something then comes over the top of it, which creates that overhang, that shelf appearance. So scar massage has a real potential here to help you to mobilize that scar tissue as it's developing and to help unstick those layers, so that the layers as we move and we stand can glide and slide over one another like they do anywhere else in the body. So that's the goal with scar massage, and the overhang can take quite a long time to improve. It's often the last thing to resolve, but along the way we're also finding that you're getting rid of altered sensation, pain, tightness, pulling, all of these things that women might just be living with for years and years otherwise. So it's really something that I'd encourage people to look into.
At the 360 Mama, you cover loads of topics, everything from the scar massage, nutrition, movement, all forms of support postpartum. Is there any kind of support during pregnancy that you recommend that people consider to help them with their postpartum recovery?
Probably in pregnancy, I discuss more about setting up who you might want to have in your corner postpartum. You don't necessarily need to see all of those professionals before the birth, but it would be quite a good idea maybe for you to know who it is that you would like to have on your side.
Get some recommendations from friends.
Exactly. With the book, for example, we made a real conscious effort to include other birth professionals as well. So we included some advice from doulas, from a hypnobirthing instructor, who was really valuable, because I think for a lot of people, particularly if they're going into a C-section, would assume that hypnobirthing isn't for them. Again, you can use all of the techniques that you learn in hypnobirthing and apply it to a C-section environment, and that really changes your experience. So she was fantastic. We had a breastfeeding consultant, we had a wound care nurse, we had a midwife, we had a birth trauma therapist. So actually knowing that all of those professionals even exist for some people is complete news to them. So I'd sort of maybe have a little look into who exists out there, what you think might apply to you, what you like the sound of. Certainly doulas can be involved in pregnancy and then continue to be there as postpartum support. In the book, we were so lucky that so many followers offered to submit their birth story for us. And then we've picked some to include in the book. And they've all been really wonderful, kind of brilliantly written stories that explains how much of a variety of birth experiences there are out there. And some of those used certain professionals along the way and others didn't, but it's quite a nice concept to maybe look into others' birth stories as well and see what you can learn from them.
It sounds like everything you're doing, and from everything I see about what you do, it does put a really positive spin on it, because although a lot of this conversation is around the terms of kind of recovery and things like that, it isn't a negative connotation. But I think it's just so important that people can hopefully watch this conversation and take away from it there are people out there to help, and just getting to the finish line in birth, there is so much. It's not just the 4th trimester or your postpartum recovery. Your body throughout pregnancy has gone through so much with, you know, little support because it's giving so much to another life, that actually the day you give birth is the time that you can focus on yourself again, because you're not physically growing the human anymore. And it is so important, longevity purposes, quality of life, and for your children, that you are strong and fit and healthy, and that actually you see that as like a really positive spin, that all these people exist only to help and make life better, not because it's necessarily got to be a hugely traumatic or awful thing, but actually that postpartum recovery is very important.
I hope so. I mean, that's definitely how we want to frame it. We don't want C-section to be something that people have a lot of fear around. Unfortunately, there is still a lot of like negative connotation around it, and that really impacts how people feel about their birth experience if it's not been their first choice. But for us, it's kind of understanding that, it's really important to have a community around you that supports you. Every birth professional I've ever come across that works in this field is hugely passionate about it, and it's just something that we need to focus a little bit more on, because there is so much out there about preparing for pregnancy, the pregnancy itself. There's even in, you know, your midwife appointments, there's a lot of focus on birth plan, and then it just stops. I just really hope that this starts to sort of make a bit of a positive change, and I'm really hoping that the book changes people's experiences, because if you are better prepared, then generally your outcomes are just so much easier on the other side.
Well, thank you so much for travelling up and sharing your time with us today. Thanks. And where can people find you?
Our handle on everything is at the 360 Mama. Amazing. We're on everything. And you can find us on our own website, which is just the www.the360mama.com. And our book has been released recently, and you can find it across most platforms. Yeah, we'd love it if you could support that.
Exciting. Well, I will definitely be having a read of that. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.